for those unfamiliar, our firm is a regulatory, event-driven firm, asset management firm, and we're keenly focused on the financial services and real estate sectors. EJF operates at the crossroads of capital and the constantly shifting regulatory environment where most of the impactful investments are available to us. Be it Dodd-Frank, the TARP program, or the recently enacted Qualified Opportunity Zone legislation, we at EJF pride ourselves on translating well-intentioned DC policies into actionable investments. With that context, today's discussion couldn't be more relevant. Regardless of your political leaning, we can all likely agree that Secretary Mnuchin and this administration have made a significant impact on the regulatory environment, on taxes, and on the economy as a whole. On regulation, the administration has completed its sweep of Fed appointments, including Jay Powell as chairman of the Federal Reserve and Randy Quarles as the Federal Reserve's vice chairman of supervision. They've installed an acting director of the CFPB and named a successor in waiting. They've named a new head of Ginnie Mae and an opportunity next year or soon to appoint a head regulator of the GSEs once those positions become available early next year. In short, the administration and Secretary Mnuchin will soon likely have their full slate of appointed regulators installed at agencies overseeing the $16.7 trillion banking industry and the $10.8 trillion mortgage market. This says nothing of the success of passing the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 that Jack referenced. Out of that law has come a number of significant changes to the tax code, changes in tax brackets, cash repatriation, and most relevant to EJF and like-minded social impact investors, the provision outlining opportunity zones. Opportunity zones provisions of the tax bill passed last year incentivize the investment of private capital into low-income communities throughout the United States, and we think that's very significant. These communities, the neighborhoods most in need of investment capital, have not historically attracted private investment, but the Opportunity Zone legislation seeks to fix that with tax-driven carrots or incentives. Unique in today's Washington, D.C. environment, Opportunity Zone legislation has benefited from a bipartisan mix of legislators and policymakers. From the bill's sponsor, South Carolina's Republican Senator Tim Scott, to its co-sponsor, New Jersey Democrat Cory Booker, Opportunity Zone legislation has garnered the attention and won praise from both sides of the political aisle, as well as at the state government level and within the social impact invested community. At EJF, we believe the Opportunity Zone legislation has the potential to fundamentally transform low-income neighborhoods by adding jobs in these areas. Opportunity zones also hold the promise of shifting investment from the wealthiest areas of our country to places most in need. And this point is critical. The legislation amplifies capital movement from rich to poor areas by incentivizing banking institutions to lend and invest in Opportunity Zone neighborhoods and businesses, and we think that is exciting. In D.C., where the word compromise can be interpreted as capitulation, the bipartisanship around this legislation really stands out. So we're very surprised that Secretary Mnuchin and the administration was able to get this piece as part of the Tax Reform Act, and we look forward to hearing his comments about this and other issues over the next 30 minutes. With that, I'll hand it back to Jack.
Thank you, Neal, and again for the partnership. And it is now my privilege to welcome the 77th Treasury Secretary of the United States, Steven Mnuchin. Joining Secretary Mnuchin on stage is my colleague, the Hill's Editor-in-Chief, Bob Cusack. Bob, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks, Mr. Secretary, for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. The last time I was with you was April of last year,
Yes.
the day we put out the tax plan.
It was good timing. Yes, and so I want to start off, the Hill is doing a 7-part series on how the Trump tax law
I've been
passed.
reading it,
Yes.
and I think you've done a great job.
Thank you. Now, the economy, few would argue, is booming. Is that because of the tax law?
Absolutely. It's taxes, it's regulatory relief, and it's our focus on better trade.
And when you pass the law, and it's obviously a key item in the midterms right now, people are talking about the tax law, whether they're for it or against it. Our 7-part series started on Monday, will conclude on Sunday, and we've been working on it for several months, both talking to administration officials as well as Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill. What were the top things? Passing anything, whether it's the Affordable Care Act, the tax law, sweeping changes are very difficult in this town. What was the key top 2 or 3 things to getting that to Trump's desk?
Well, first of all, we couldn't be more excited about these changes. I think this was 30 years in the making very significant changes to the tax, all the tax rules and tax issues associated. I'd say a lot of the success was, first of all, this goes back to the campaign. So this was one of the fundamental economic issues that we designed during the campaign, that the president campaigned on and said he would get tax cuts and tax reform done. And I think the other issue was, it was very clear this needed to be a combined effort of the administration, the House, and the Senate. And we worked very, very closely all along the way. We made compromises. I think all 3 of us had slightly different issues. We fundamentally had the same idea, but we had slightly different issues. And I think the success was we worked very closely together to get an overall plan.
Now, critics say that it's going to blow a hole in the deficit, but you've made the case that it's going to grow the economy. The last quarter was 4.2%. Are you confident that the economy will continue to grow at 3+% in the coming years?
Well, our plan was, the entire economic plan was, how do we get the economy to grow at 3% sustained GDP? Because the difference between 2% and 3% is trillions of dollars to the government and an enormous amount to American taxpayers. So the real focus is, what did we need to do? And the Tax Act was a major component of that. And let me just highlight a few things. First of all, we changed the business tax system from a worldwide tax system where we taxed on worldwide income, but if you deferred and didn't bring the cash back onshore, you didn't pay the tax. So think about that. That made no sense. All that did was encourage trillions of dollars to stay offshore. So we changed it to what we call a territorial system that led to all that money coming back onshore. We brought down the rate to a very competitive level, 21%. And we created massive middle-income tax cuts. Now, on the what did it cost side, as I like to say, we could debate this, but it's simple math. The answer is, if we're able to achieve sustained 3% growth over the period of time, we think this will raise in excess of $1 trillion of additional revenues. The critics say we scored this with 0 growth, $1.5 trillion. So when people say this is going to cost $1 trillion, that assumes there's literally 0 growth. And I think the break even was about 35 or 40 basis points of additional growth for it to be break even.
As you know, no Democrat supported the final bill, but there were some bipartisan ideas, and home opportunity zones, one of them. What kind of impact will that have as far as spurring investment and the economy?
I couldn't be more excited about the opportunity zones, and Tim Scott really deserves a lot of credit for this. And Tim and I have been traveling the country together and apart trying to sell this, because I think it's the least known part of it. I think there's going to be over $100 billion of private capital that will be invested in opportunity zones. And the way it worked was, each state, the governor had the right to designate multiple census tracts. The Treasury had to approve them. We've already done that, so step 1 is done. And there are many, many attractive places to invest all across the country. Everywhere from the entire island of Puerto Rico is an opportunity zone, to New York, California, Wisconsin, all different types of places, which in most cases the census tracts are not that far from where there's lots of business. This will unlock lots of capital that was tied up that never would have been sold to reinvest in these communities. And people are not only focused on the real estate opportunity, which I think is a smaller part of it, but the bigger part is really for people to relocate businesses or start new businesses in these opportunity zones. And I think will be a tremendous help to these underserved communities.
The tax law in general, the polls out there are fairly lukewarm. Those are Republican polls that we lost the message war. Why is that?
I don't think we've lost the message war at all. I mean, I think if you look at, we had over 4% GDP. That won't be for the year, but now you even have the Federal Reserve forecasting above 3% GDP for the year. I think that, as you asked me in the beginning, and I said, the biggest part of that is the Tax Act. Again, another powerful part of the Tax Act was automatic expensing. We have capital investment at the highest level it's now been in 25 years. So we're just beginning to see the beginning impact, and I think over the next few years we'll see that continue on.
The headlines recently really focused on, well, many things, but in particular tariffs and trade. Are we in a trade war?
Have there been some headlines?
A few. Are we in a trade war with China?
No, we're in a trade dispute with China, and this is not new. A lot of these same issues that we're dealing with today are the same issues that Secretary Paulson and others dealt with 10 years ago. I think most people understand that we have a market that is very free and open for Chinese companies to sell into and invest in, and we're looking for fair and reciprocal treatment. And the reason why we have a giant trade gap with China is because they can sell whatever they want here, and we are highly restricted, and we are focused on increasing U.S. exports to narrow the trade gap. And I think that's one of the single greatest opportunities for American companies and American workers.
Will there be talks soon with Beijing, with China, Chinese government to get some type of deal?
I don't want to go through, this has become very public, okay?
Yeah.
So there were talks that were planned here in D.C., but we've been talking, I mean, since I've been in office, we've been talking. So some of the times, I think this would have been our 5th big meeting, but there's been constant dialogue behind the scenes in one format. Sometimes it's active, sometimes it's not active, but we've made very clear to them what we want. And I think most people understand this is about fair trade. People ask me, is this about containing China? This is not about containing China. This is about fair reciprocal trade. Since China entered the WTO, World Trade Organization, they've taken advantage of the rules, they've built up their companies and their businesses, and they have not given us the same opportunity. But by the way, with 1,350,000,000 people and a growing middle class, if our companies can compete fairly, I mean, this is hundreds of billions of dollars a year in potential exports.
President Trump, just yesterday, he said China is interfering with our 2018 midterm election. Is that true? And will we get more information on exactly what they're doing?
Well, I'm only going to comment publicly on what the president has said. But the fact that they targeted tariffs on our farmers and our bourbon and lobsters in Maine, this is not coincidental. They picked tariffs on areas that they think the president is sensitive to, and I think that's one of the things he was referring to when he was referring to their interference.
There has been reports that there were a 4-page pamphlet in an Iowa newspaper that tried to influence, experts say.
I've heard it, I haven't seen it, but I've heard about that as well.
But you don't think that these things are coincidences?
Oh, they're definitely not coincidences, they're completely planned. And again, I would just say, just to put this in perspective, we started this with tariffs on $50 billion. That was roughly 10% of their goods. It was to deal with the technology issues, to deal with the unfair trade practices. Their response at 50% was the equivalent of almost 50% of what we sell. So the reason why we're doing 250 is because it's a proportional response.
Another trade issue is renegotiating NAFTA. There has been a deal with Mexico.
Yeah, couldn't be more excited about that.
Will there be a deal with Canada?
I hope so. I mean, we have an important trading relationship with Canada. I think Ambassador Lighthizer and others have done a great job negotiating this. I know there's ongoing discussions, and we reached a deal with Mexico. Well, why shouldn't we be able to reach a deal with Canada? So I hope Canada will agree to the last few remaining open items.
Do you see a timetable there?
I'm not going to comment on any specific timetable.
Do you think that you would need Canada, because some people in Congress certainly are saying, without Canada, it can't happen? It can't
No,
be approved.
I don't think that's the case. I think that if for whatever reason we don't reach an agreement with Canada, the Mexico agreement, we'll have an agreement with Mexico. It's a great agreement. We couldn't be more excited to work with the new administration. I think it's a terrific opportunity for us to expand our economic relationship with them, and I'm confident that Congress will pass that.
Have you briefed Congress on the details of the deal, and what kind of feedback are you getting on the deal with Mexico?
So really, Ambassador Lighthizer is the primary person who deals with Congress. I do get questions on this when I go up there, but as a matter of fact, I think he's there today and tomorrow doing briefings.
Okay. Are you hopeful for a deal in the coming weeks/months with North Korea?
Well, I couldn't be more hopeful and more excited about and more optimistic about the opportunity and where we are in North Korea. And Treasury has been involved, working very closely with state and with the president all along on this, with sanctions. I had the opportunity to go with the president to the UN this week. I was there with him last year. Last year, people were worried that we were close to war with North Korea. And now we're close to a historic agreement. So I think, as the president has said, we're focused on having them get rid of nuclear weapons. I think we've made a lot of progress in the last year. We got back remains of military people, which is very important to those families. They've begun the process of dealing with test sites and others. And again, a year ago, they were shooting missiles over Japan. So, a year ago, I remember sitting in trilabs with South Korea and Japan and us, dealing with what was a very scary time.
But the sanctions will remain in place until
They will
get
indeed.
a deal. Okay. What is the latest on indexing capital gains to inflation? Can the Treasury, there's a big dispute of whether this has to be done by Congress, or can the administration do it on its own?
Well, as I've talked about this before, I'm not going to go into the specifics of what we can do and what we can't do. It is something that has been studied before at Treasury. It is something we're studying again. We're going to do a thorough analysis on this, and it's something we'll discuss with the president and consider.
There are some in the financial community that are, despite the stock market and the economy and the unemployment down on a number of sectors, that a recession is coming. You think there's any chance of that?
I think those are the same people who said we'd never hit 3% growth.
So you're not concerned with the state. You think that this will continue, this economy will continue to soar. Obviously, the markets go up and down, and that's not the indicator of all the economy, but it's a key indicator.
I would say, I think we have visibility into a few years. I think we couldn't be more optimistic about economic growth over the next few years. And, there can always be world events and different things that impact us, but we don't believe, some people will say, oh, this was a one-time fiscal stimulus. Quite the opposite. This was a fundamental change of the tax laws that make U.S. businesses very competitive. This was not just about tax cuts. This was about fundamental changes to both the personal side, the lowest rates for pass-through businesses since the 1930s, and fundamentally changing the worldwide tax system so that we're competitive.
We've talked about this before. There's a lot of attention on legislation as it moves through Congress, and what's less sexy is actually the implementation, which you're knee-deep in. What's coming down the pipe, and do you see that next year the effect of the tax law will be bigger than this past year? Obviously, a lot of things didn't go into effect this year, they will next year.
Well, as you pointed out, the legislation was very important in getting it done. But since this has passed, we literally meet every day in my conference room, a joint team from the IRS and from our Office of Tax Policy and our legal office and other areas of Treasury on the implementation. Because this is a very important part that we get this done and we get it done correctly. And that means it changes almost everything at the IRS. It changes everything from customer service to forms to technology. We're working on a major technology plan, not only on implementing this, but upgrading the IRS technology over the next 5 years and passing regulations. So I think we've, some of these regulations have 300 or 400 pages associated with them. We need to provide clarity to taxpayers so that they know how to execute the plan. And we talked about opportunity zones. We're excited that hopefully in the next few weeks the regulations will come out on opportunity zones, and that will allow for people to start investing immediately.
What about, it's such a massive undertaking, when you have a sweeping of the tax laws, do you have enough resources to implement the law? Will that be a factor in what the President requests in his upcoming budget?
Well, we did get extra money for technology implementation, for putting in place the tax plan, but I would say on an ongoing basis, we will be working with Congress on more money to upgrade IRS technology, because we've underinvested in technology and it's critical that we bring it into the modern age.
What's the latest with Venezuela? You've been very outspoken on that. Where does it go from here?
I've been outspoken.
Yeah, you're pretty outspoken, I think. You're on TV a lot.
It's a very difficult situation. Venezuela is a country that has very rich resources, has lots of oil, and this is a country where the people are suffering tremendously. We have lots of migration out of the country. We have tremendous poverty, and this is something where we have been very active in using sanctions, specifically at the government, to try to change behavior, because it's really, it's a very difficult situation.
The debt level, it's something that was talked about all along, 2010, the big election issue. It's not, government spending is not a big issue right now, but the debt continues to grow. What is this administration's plan of dealing with this massive problem?
Well, let me make a couple of comments on this.
Other than the growth. Right?
Let me make a couple of comments. Probably the biggest single increase in the debt was as a result of the wars in the Middle East. And I think we've said that cost as much as $8 trillion in debt. So that's something that the president has been very concerned about. So the president inherited a large amount of debt, and that's something we're focused on. As you said, the number one issue on the debt is to increase growth, because the difference, as I referenced earlier, between 2 and 3% is trillions of dollars. But the issue of government spending is something that the president's focused on. Now, when he came into office, the president worked on a balanced budget, but the president was very determined to have military spending. And we had underinvested in the military. We thought that was very important. We needed to get pay raises. We needed to get more capital investment, given what was going on all around the world. And the Democrats required us to increase non-military spending on the other side. So government spending is something we're looking at. I think, as you know, the president's got to sign a spending bill so that we don't close down government. But this is a longer-term issue that the president and I and Vic Mulvaney and others have definitely discussed.
You confident he'll sign the bill? Appropriation bill?
I think he will sign the bill.
But going back to spending, at some point, a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill, including Speaker Bryan, say entitlement spending has to be tackled. Medicare, Social Security, at some point, is that something that this administration is willing to tackle in the next couple of years?
Well, our focus right now is really on step one, was to create economic growth, because that's what creates opportunities for Americans and taxpayers, hardworking taxpayers, and to focus on government spending that we can control. That's really our focus at this point.
It's something called the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. This is an Obama-era law, and critics have said, and I believe it was in the Republican convention, that it's been poorly implemented and it's aimed at Americans' use of overseas bank accounts, requires an enormous amount of data from financial institutions to be reported. Is this something the administration is looking to refine, change, scrap?
Well, we're not looking to scrap it, but we are looking to refine the execution of it. And I think, as you know, terrorist financing, combating terrorist financing is a major focus of mine. As I've mentioned before, I probably spend close to half my time on that issue and sanctions. And the fact of reporting is an important component on it. But on the other hand, like everything else, we can't have too much regulation. We need to make sure that we have the right balance between getting the information and people being able to do business and banks being able to do business overseas.
Going back to the tax law, what was President Trump's management style on it? A lot of Republicans, we wrote this week, that had a healthcare hangover from the failure to replace Obamacare, and there were a lot of questions about the Republican Party not being able to govern. How did he steer the bill? There were some people on the Hill who said, listen, this can't get done in 2017. It's just, we don't have enough time for it to get done. How did he deal with it on a day-to-day basis?
We were always confident that it would get done. The president was involved in this, I would say, on a daily basis. And going back to the campaign, I remember on what we referred to as Trump Force One, which was his plane. I remember going on the way to Detroit for his speech at the Economic Club, where we launched his economic program. Larry Kudlow was on the plane with me at the time, and literally the president had his black marker out and was changing the speech at the last minute, and we were refining the different parts of the tax codes. The president has been instrumentally involved in the details of this from day one. And as I said, on a daily basis, we would report back from our meetings from what we called the Group of Six, and seek the president's guidance on important issues.
You mentioned earlier that the House and the Senate and the White House had different plans. Basically the same, but there were differences, and there were key differences. Border adjustment tax was an issue that the House was pushing for. The Senate, as you know, was not pushing for it. And Lindsey Graham at one point said there are not 10 votes in the Senate for that controversial plan, which would have raised money. And that was what Speaker Ryan and Kevin Brady made the argument for. When the White House came up with its plan in the spring of last year, it did not include it. And then it seemed that the effort moved forward. Was that a key moment in convincing the House, listen, whatever the merits of this idea are, that it just doesn't have the votes to actually pass this?
Well, let me just say, Paul Ryan and Chairman Brady did an enormous amount of work in creating the blueprint, and I think that was very, very helpful, all the work that had been done before the president arrived. But we also, during the campaign, we put out our own plan, and at the time, the president's plan did not include the border adjustment tax. I won't comment whether it would have gotten 10 votes, but it was not going to get 50 votes, 50 plus the vice president, and that was very clear to us. And the focus was, what can we do to pass tax reform that will change the fundamental problems with the business tax system and give a big middle income tax cut. And it was very clear to us early on that there weren't going to be enough votes in the Senate for the border adjustment tax. And given its complexity, what the impact it would have had on the economy it was a sweeping change that led to us being concerned.
Democrats say, and that's one part of our series, is that there really wasn't an effort to have a bipartisan deal. But there were meetings, I know you had meetings, we interviewed Ivanka Trump, and she said had a number of dinners with Democrats. Why didn't bipartisanship materialize on this bill?
Well, we definitely had a lot of meetings early on, and read some of this in your series and the Ivanka and Jerry dinner. But I would say there were a series of meetings early on. The Democrats gave some very specific criteria that were required for them to move forward with us. And one of them was that they would not agree to dynamic scoring. So when you talk about revenue neutral, the question is, are you going to do revenue neutral based upon dynamic scoring, or are you going to do revenue neutral based upon growth? It was critical for us that we thought we would pay for this through growth. But there were other issues as well. So, I mean, I would say, had there been an opportunity to negotiate on a bipartisan basis, we would have pursued that. But it was very clear they had a very different agenda.
But you said you were surprised that you didn't get, that there weren't a few Democrats, maybe in the red states that are up for the election, that decided not to.
I was surprised. I think, as the president has said, the Democrats do a better job of keeping their voting bloc together.
Obviously, we have an election coming up. What do you think could be on the agenda next year? Let's say, whether Democrats win the House or Senate. Most experts say there'll be more Democrats in Congress than there are now. We'll see. But could an infrastructure bill move? What else do you see moving next year?
Well, let me just comment on some of the things that I was involved in this year away from the tax plan. The tax plan was not bipartisan, but I would just say we got a Dodd-Frank bill passed on a bipartisan basis, which I think was very important, and it allows additional lending for community banks, and something that was very important. We worked on the FIRMA legislation, which had overwhelming support on investments and bringing CFIUS up to date. One of the president very much wants to do infrastructure. That will be a priority for next year. I'm very much focused on housing reform. That was something that I said that I was interested in from day one. That is going to need to be done on a bipartisan basis, and something that I absolutely will focus on again next year. As I like to say, we've left the GSEs under government control for 10 years. I am committed that we come up with a bipartisan solution so that they're not sitting in government control for another 10 or 20 or 50 years. We've got to get the taxpayers out of the risk business on the GSEs. And we also got to look at FHA as part of that, because we want to make sure if we fix Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, we don't leave all the risk at HUD through FHA.
Last question. President Trump has said that General Kelly will be his chief of staff through 2020. You liking the job? Are you going to be here through 2020?
Oh, I'm absolutely going to be here through 2020, and if the president wants me here for the second term, then I'd be here with him as well.
What's the best part of the job?
It is by far the most interesting job I've ever had. What's great about Treasury is it spans so many issues, from national security issues, foreign policy issues with sanctions, to the Tax Act. And even the one thing I never thought I'd get involved in with the government was the post office. Did a little bit of studying because I chair the Federal Financing Bank, and the post office is our largest creditor. So I updated the president on some of my thoughts on the post office, and the next thing I knew, he put me in charge of a task force. So we're also looking at postal reform. So between the IRS and the post office, we have two big government entities that we are trying to bring into the modern age.
Secretary Mnuchin, thanks for joining us this
Thank
morning.
you.